Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. Hello, Warbirders. So this episode is part of a series, so if you're just discovering the channel and you want to see things in order, well, step out to take on the F4F Wildcat, the F5F Skyrocket, and the F6F Hellcat. Don't worry that we skipped the F7F. We'll get back to that, I promise. And before we get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell to never miss a thing. So why did we need a Bearcat at all? Grumman already had a winner with the Hellcat, which was so good that it was named the Zero Killer and Ace Maker of the Pacific, and doing great work over in Europe with the Fleet Air arm of the Royal Navy. And they were building so many of them that I've read that actually it was sometimes easier to push one that needed serious maintenance overboard because there were so many brand new ones kicking around. But Grumman was still obsessed with climb performance, and with good reason. At the start of the war, when the US pilots were struggling to hold their own against the Japanese Zeros and their sisters with Grumman Wildcats and Brewster Buffaloes, Grumman officials had heard again and again from pilots that they needed to get upstairs faster. So, like a dog with a bone, Grumman had obsessed on the matter. They also had another serious problem that needed solving. The Escort carrier was a pure World War II invention that had gone from nothing to build as many of these things as you possibly can almost overnight. The Allies ended up building an astonishing 130 of them. World War II production of all kinds never ceases to amaze me. So what's the problem? An escort carrier is useless without airplanes to use on it. So far they had used the F4F Wildcat, and although it would soldier on throughout the war to the very end, it was becoming obsolete. So you say, big deal. Grumman is cranking out Hellcats like toasters, so assign some of them to the escort carriers. Well, they couldn't. They were too big. Everyone always goes on and on about the P-47 being big and a juggernaut and all that, but the Hellcat was just as big. In fact, it even had a bigger wing area, and so it just could not operate on the baby flat tops or Jeep carriers as they were called. So, do you see where this is going? Grumman wanted more performance than the Hellcat, but with the same engine. They also simultaneously needed an aircraft that could operate on a smaller ship. Looks like we're headed for Smallville. Small is beautiful. Nice things come in small packages. Less is going to be more. Grumman's team, working under Chief Engineer William Schwendler, one of the founders of the company, went to work. There were similarities to the Hellcat in what they came up with. The new fighter was also a cantilever low-wing monoplane of all-metal construction, and it used the same NACA 230 airfoil that carried the Hellcat along. But there weren't going to be too many similarities. How could there be? Schwendler was aiming for a fully loaded weight of 8,750 pounds. The Hellcat weighed 9,238 pounds empty. Let those numbers sink in. With a pilot, full fuel, and weapons, the new fighter was to be about 500 pounds lighter than a Hellcat without any of those on board. Keep that in mind as we talk about some of the radical things that they did to keep the weight down. Firstly, it was going to be small, 5 feet shorter than the Hellcat. In fact, it was 6 inches shorter than the Wildcat. Yes, you heard that right. The wingspan was even shorter than the small Wildcat by 3 feet. The smaller sizes meant that on a crowded flight deck, 50 of the new fighters would be able to fit in the real estate taken up by 36 Hellcats. Less is more indeed. Getting back to the wings, of course they still had to fold because this was a carrier fighter, but the new fighter wouldn't get the trademark Grumman stow wings. It would get a more simple and lighter hinge system that would fold upwards manually by the crew. While we're speaking of wings, we need to talk about the other radical design decisions made for this wing. And when I say radical, I mean it. The feature that I'm about to describe I have never heard of being installed in any other aircraft before or after. As always, I'd love to hear if it has been, if anyone knows. So, in order to withstand G-forces, the wing has to be made strong. Well, duh, right? Well, to make the whole wing strong enough to withstand high G-forces requires a lot of weight in order to beef up the wing structure. Now, stick with me here. Some of that heavy structure way out on the wing is only going to need to support high G-forces very rarely. So the rest of the time, the plane is hauling around that extra structural weight for nothing. The Grumman team pondered, what if we just left it out? Of course, that means that in some of those rare, very high G maneuvers, it could break. Okay, well, airplanes have come back without wingtips before. What if we made the wingtips intentionally weak, and thus lighter, and provide a breakaway point where they could snap off in a controlled and expected spot that would still provide enough lift to get back to the carrier? On the ship, they could have a supply of expendable wingtips, which the deck crew could just reattach. But what happens if one tip breaks off and not the other, causing a radical imbalance? Easy. Provide explosive bolts to blow off the wingtip that is hanging on. Yes, that was the plan. Part of the wing was designed to break, and if it didn't, to be intentionally blown off. The radical diet didn't end there. A constant theme in this channel is adding more and bigger guns. Not here. The new fighter was getting only 4 50 caliber machine guns. It was also only going to have a 160-gallon internal fuel supply, while the Hellcat had 250 gallons. Remember, they have the same engine, so the new fighter was going to have both limited firepower and range. Even the tailhook was made more simple and lighter. Once it was extended, the tailhook could not be retracted from the cockpit. Flight deck crew would have to manually push it back up. Even the prop was smaller. The Hellcat had a 13-foot 3-bladed Hamilton standard propeller. A slight reduction in size was made by moving to a 12-foot Aero Products 4-bladed propeller. There are times when the weight saving seems obsessive and even silly, reminding me of the stories of Lindbergh cutting off the margins of his maps to save weight. I don't know how many pounds they saved by leaving out a seat adjustment mechanism, but they did. But I guess cushions are lighter, and that is what the pilot would have to use to adjust his seat. Some items just couldn't be compromised. There would still be ample armor protection for the pilot, engine, and oil cooler, no matter what the weight penalty was. To still maintain the strength for punishing carrier operations, a thicker aluminum skin would be used. But there are 4 factors in flight: thrust, drag, weight, and lift. We haven't spoken of drag reduction. Dedicated care was taken in reducing drag around the engine cowling, leading edge, intakes, and the rivets were all flush. The canopy was a super slippery bubble style with great visibility for the pilot. Okay, so all of that was the theory and the goals. It was time to start building prototypes and see if the theory could be translated to flying and fighting reality. Do you like what you're seeing? Why not click super thanks? I'd really appreciate it. The blueprints were completed by November 1943, and that same month orders were placed for 2 prototypes of what Bureau of Air called F8F1 and would be known as a Bearcat. So what is a Bearcat anyway? Is it a bear? Is it a cat? Well, it's a binturong and lives in Southeast Asia. It is neither a bear nor a cat. Okay, enough for the wildlife lesson. Back to the airplane. The first prototype flew only 9 months later in August 1944. Some results were great. The Bearcat's rate of climb was 30% higher than the Hellcat, with 4,800 feet per minute, and an impressive top speed of 424 miles per hour. Compared to its established sisters, the Hellcat and the Corsair, the Bearcat was more maneuverable and, as I just stated, climbed much better. But there were criticisms, including complaints about a cramped cockpit, poor directional stability, an erratic airspeed indicator, and a landing gear operation airspeed that needed to be increased. Oh yes, the pilots also asked, Oliver Twist style, "Please, sir, could we please have more guns?" I don't know if anything was done about the cramped cockpit. It seems that the Bearcat was so small that you couldn't even say that you put it on like some fighters, but that you saddled it up. A fillet just ahead of the vertical stabilizer fixed the directional stability problem. Oh yeah, the extra gun request was turned down. It was time to start building Bearcats. The test pilots in the Navy were impressed enough with the Bearcat to sign contracts only 2 months later. Grumman was to build about 2,000, and General Motors would build about 2,000 more. The General Motors Birds would have a slightly different engine and a small increase in fuel capacity. Bearcats began flying out of the Grumman factory in May 1945, the same month the war in Europe ended. In August, the war against Japan ended too, and the orders were slashed. GM's contracts were completely cancelled, and Grumman's were trimmed down to 770 machines, which is still a pretty good order considering, there's no more war to fight now. In 1948, the F8F2 was introduced. The cowling was tweaked, and it had a slightly more powerful engine, turning out 2,240 horsepower. There was a taller vertical fin, probably to counter the increased torque of the more powerful engine. Later models had the 50 cals replaced by 20mm cannon. A dozen were built as F8F2N night fighters, and 60 F8F2Ps were configured as reconnaissance versions. They continued building them until 1949. So, unlike most other aircraft I've profiled, this one never fought for its producing country, although it was extensively used. It took over primary duties from the Hellcats and equipped 24 fighter squadrons with the Navy and the Marines. One thing that didn't work quite as was hoped was the snap-off wingtips. It was one of those things that worked well in controlled conditions, which isn't the real world and definitely isn't carrier aviation. There were several accidents when one tip broke off and the other didn't at low altitude, and the aircraft crashed, killing the pilots. Another time, a ground technician died when the explosive bolts blew up unexpectedly on the ground. In the end, the snap-off wingtip experiment was ended. The tips were strengthened, and the aircraft had a G limit of 7.5 that the whole wing, including the tips, could handle. In 1946, Bearcats took over duties with the Blue Angels, replacing the Hellcat, and they flew it until 1950 and the start of the Korean War. Speaking of Korea, did you wonder why Bearcats didn't fight there? At the start of the conflict in Korea, there was little air opposition, and so a pure fighter wasn't really needed. What was needed was ground support, and the F4U Corsair was judged to be better suited to that job. But the Bearcat did see combat, just not with the US. In 1951, France ordered 200 Bearcats for its Armée de l'Air. Why would France want these nearly obsolete aircraft? Cost. They got them for a really good price. And they were only intending to use them in French colonies, especially Indochina, which, was heating up. Just like Korea, the need was for ground attack, which, as I said before, wasn't really the Bearcat's thing. But the price was nice, and because of its carrier-based pedigree, it was great for use on short, even grass, airstrips, some of which had been built by the Japanese during their war. Although it wasn't ideal for ground attack, it was fast. So when a call came for help, it would be there quickly. And soon, HVAR rockets, 1,000-pound bombs, and napalm would be on target. When the French war in Vietnam ended in 1954, the French forces left behind 28 Bearcats. They served with the Republic of Vietnam Air Force until 1964. In terms of surviving aircraft, the Bearcat, known as Rare Bear, is a rare bear indeed. In fact, she probably shouldn't exist at all. The Bearcat with the construction number 122629 was enrolled in the Navy in 1948 and flew with several active squadrons until 1952. That year, this Bearcat was bumped to a Naval Reserves Unit and then a Naval Air Reserve Training Unit in Alabama. Between 1953 and 1956, it bounced around in storage at various Navy bases until 1957, when it was struck from the U.S. Navy with 667 hours total time. Eventually, the Bearcat was rechristened Rare Bear. More fixing and tinkering to the engine and supercharger allowed the 18-cylinder radial to pump out 4,000 horsepower. Adding in spurts of nitrous oxide pushed that up another 500 for an incredible 4,500 total horsepower. With all of that power and the flying skill of pilot Shelton, Rare Bear has won 16 racing championships and holds the world's record for the 3 kilometers piston world speed record of 528.33 miles per hour set on August 21st, 1989, and the piston time to climb a record to 3,000 meters, that's 10,000 feet, in 91.9 seconds set in 1972. The previous record had been set in 1946 and also in a Bearcat. Rare Bear hasn't raced since 2015. It has seemed way more down and out many times before, so who knows what the future brings for this rarest of Bearcats. As for the other surviving Bearcats, they are well represented in both static display and airworthy condition. Turns out that with the Bearcat, less definitely turned out to be more. In my next Grumman Cat episode, we will be going in a different direction with the F7F Tiger Cat. The theme of that episode is going to be more is more. If you enjoy these videos, please do your part and become a member of the channel, or drop me a super thanks. If you can't do either of those, then please just like and subscribe and hit the bell. It's really appreciated. Until next time.